Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. How was your weekend?
Pretty good. Not that crazy like usual.
Well, that's good. So, how are you feeling about chapter 8?
Actually this one, I don't know if it's just me, but I actually feel a lot more confident about this one than other ones.
Yeah, definitely. This one is kind of almost more historical, I think.
Yes, I think
Um,
that's why I feel more confident.
so we have a nice 10 slideshow. It's just kind of covering the basics, and then I have some true false questions, and then I'll probably work a couple more in orally.
Okay.
Do you want to start, or do you want to talk about the exam before we go?
I think we can talk about the exam after.
Okay, let's do that then.
Okay.
So there's the early era, and so this is going to be like in the 1800s. So labor unions in the United States were not seen as good; they were not looked upon favorably. I want to highlight two strikes. There's the Haymarket strike, and so that one the police actually got involved, and they busted up the strike. And then the Pullman strike, the army was used to bust the strike. And I think that was a railroad strike. I didn't write his name down, but it's going to be Eugene V. Debs. And so he was this like social activist. He wanted to deal with social unions. And then we have Samuel Gompers and the AFL. I believe it's the American Federation of Labor. And so he pushed business unions that focused on wage and benefits. So true or false, social unionism was adopted over business unionism in the United States.
True.
So it's actually going to be false. So we have business unionism here. Okay.
Oh, okay, yes.
Okay. In the early era, this
Oh,
is true or
yes.
false. In the early era, unions were seen as criminal conspiracies against trade.
Mm, true.
Yeah. So early back in the day, like it was against the law. Like they
Right.
were punished, kind of under that the Sherman Act. Because remember the Sherman Act was criminal. Number three, the Clayton Act was passed and subsequently excluded unions from antitrust law. True or false?
False.
True. That's why, remember, because we covered in the last chapter, there was like three exceptions. It was like labor unions, farming co-ops, and then another thing. But anyway,
Oh,
yeah, the Clayton Act was passed and excluded from antitrust law. Okay.
yeah.
So that is true. Number four, yellow dog contracts are contracts where employees agree to not join a union upon subsequent employment. True or false?
True.
True. Yeah. So yellow dog contracts, they actually eventually become outlawed, but
Right.
um and kind of the history of it is the reason why it was outlawed was back in the Great Depression, like you would just sign anything just to get a job.
Right.
So that's why they were subsequently outlawed. So the Great Depression and the New Deal. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Congress sought to pass legislation to help the workforce. There was 30% unemployment. It was bad. I
Mhm.
want to highlight two acts. The first one is going to be the Norris LaGuardia Act, and that one outlawed yellow dog contracts.
Okay.
Then there's the Wagner Act. First thing it does is it explicitly legalizes unions. It's also known as the Magna Carta of the American labor movement. Got two true or false questions. True or false, all employees are covered by the Wagner Act.
True.
It's false.
Yeah.
Not all employees are covered by the Wagner Act. True or false, company unions were unlawful under Section 8 of the Wagner Act.
True.
It's also false. Excuse me. It is true. You were
Okay.
right. I wrote it. That's why I write it down. Then I was like, no, and then I looked at. No, it is true. And we'll talk about that in more in detail. So the Wagner Act. So Section 2 actually defines what an employee is. That's the E dash or the E apostrophe E. It's my abbreviation. There's a professor at A&M. Professor, her name starts with an H. Haley. She
Hmm.
abbreviates employee E apostrophe E and employer E apostrophe R and employment E apostrophe EMT. So if you see that, that's what you know.
Okay.
So section 2 defines employee. So it's going to exclude all these people. It's going to exclude virtually all government employees, like 99.9999%. Okay. Railroad and airline employees are also going to be excluded. And that's because they're handled under a different legislation. It also excludes domestic servants, so like house servants, and then those who work for their spouse or a parent, agricultural laborers, and do you have another idea of someone it might exclude?
Um, let me see. Wasn't it like what's it called? Like federal or state employees?
That we already got that, and that one is already excluded government employees.
Yes. Okay. Um, well, I would say teachers, but they're government employees too. Um, oh, I know it. Domestic.
It's independent contractors because they're not employees, and
Right.
then bosses, supervisors. Okay.
Yeah.
So Section 8, so that deals with company unions or unions that are endorsed by or funded by companies. They're
Oh,
unlawful. So if a company says, "Oh yeah, like y'all use this union," no, we're going to actually help pay union dues. No.
yeah, okay.
And you're probably thinking like, well, what's wrong about a company, supporting a union? Well, maybe that's like undue influence on the union,
Right.
or you want the employees to actually have real freedom to pick who they want to represent them. So
Yes.
true or false, an independent contractor is included as a protected party under the Wagner Act.
True.
It's false. We just talked about that. The independent contractor is not. They're excluded from the Wagner Act.
Yes.
Okay, no problem. That's why I have these. It's just it's keep you reviewing. Okay, number 2, employees might be protected if they use social media to complain about working conditions.
I feel like that's false.
It's true. It's true. So I'm using some of these as to like review what we just talked about and then also foreshadow what's coming up. I'm trying a
Okay.
new method. Okay, so Wagner Act continued. Section 3 is it establishes the National Labor Relations Board. It's an independent agency. It's a independent executive agency. So just to review, that means the president can hire, fire, and appoint, but it's not under a cabinet.
Okay.
And you know that because it doesn't say department. And you're gonna have I believe I think you still have the cumulative final. So I'm trying to like work in these nuggets. So the National Labor Relations Board is a federal agency that administers labor law. Section 7, so this deals with union and non-union employee rights. So employees may form labor organizations and engage in collective bargaining. I put a question mark because what does collective bargaining mean to you, and then what does it actually mean? So just lay it on me.
Collective bargaining. I would think that would mean collective bargaining. I don't know, like a group of people deciding this is how much we're gonna bargain for. I guess that you can say.
Yeah, and so like that's a great way. So it isn't necessarily just wages, but it's
Right.
banding together as a collective. So it's not one
Right.
person, but it's that, and it could be a representative speaking for a group, but it isn't individualized action, or you're not just doing something just for yourself, you're doing something for the greater the organization or the bargaining unit.
Right.
And then you're saying, we want better hours, we want better pay, we want better working conditions, we want work off, we don't want to work on Sundays. That's what that is. So employees may engage in collective bargaining, and that's kind of discussing, petitioning, and they may form labor unions. And the reason why that's so important is, what's the point of legalizing labor unions if they can't actually do anything once in a union? Okay, so you have to like authorize it, and then you have to authorize procedures for them.
Right.
There's a case on point, and another thing I've started doing is I've started going to the back of the chapter and like looking at like what do you want you to understand. So instead of me just working it in as content and talking points, trying to highlight it more. So the
Okay.
NLRB versus Washington Aluminum. So here's what happened. There were some non-union employees, okay? And it isn't clear whether there was a union in the first place or there was just non-union employees. So I don't think it really matters. But these non-union employees engaged in concerted activities, also known as collective bargaining, in protest to working conditions, and they were fired. And the National Labor Relations Board said, you can't do that. You can't fire them because they were engaged in collective bargaining.
Right.
Now, if they went on strike, the company could hire replacements and they could be permanent or temporary, but you couldn't fire them. And
Yeah.
if you hired permanent guys, you don't have to give them their job back when the regular workers come back. If you actually hired permanent workers, but you can't say you hired temporary workers and then lay the other people off and then proceed to hire new people. Like you
Okay.
can't do that. But so concerted activities are allowed if they're done so for mutual aid or protection. Two of the guys can't just say, we're going on strike, it has to be just for their own selfish reason. It has to be done for the betterment of everything. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's like, collective bargaining agreement,
Right.
concerted activities. So we kind of just, I asked you, then you answered, what does collective bargaining mean? You hit the nail on the head. Wagner Act continued. This Wagner Act is long. Okay, so Section 8 deals with employer unfair labor practices. And notice I said employer. So the Wagner Act does not cover unfair labor practices committed by employees. It doesn't, they don't exist under the Wagner Act. Now, that's not true in later legislation,
Right.
but under the Wagner Act, only employers could mess up, okay?
Yeah.
So an employer could not and cannot interfere or restrain forming unions or collective bargaining. So if an employer said, you can't unionize here, that's a violation. Or if an employer said, I'm going to refuse to speak to you, that's an unfair labor practice. Section 8A3 prohibits discrimination on the basis of union participation. An example of that would be Marilyn, I'm not going to give you a promotion because you support unions, or I'm not going to give you a promotion because you're in a union, or something along that lines. Section 8A5, it is an unfair labor practice if an employer refuses to participate in collective bargaining. And in swim notes, that may be really hard to prove because there's no duty to agree to the collective bargaining. So there's a duty that the two sides kind of have to sit down and discuss certain topics, but maybe like how do you show that? Maybe the employer says, okay, talk to me while I'm doing something, and then they just ignore them. So
Right.
that's hard to show. Is it unlawful under the Wagner Act? Absolutely. Like they need to have attention, and they need to pay attention to this, but it's going to be hard to prove it. And then, like I said, there's no duty. The employer isn't obligated. It's like once the employees all sit down and say, we want to make $100,000 each year. We want, paid lunches. We want, 12 days a month of sick leave, or paid time off. Like it doesn't matter if that's what they all agreed to. The employer doesn't actually have to accept it, but they kind of got to listen. So this is I guess a true or false question for you. An employer may choose to fire or not hire an employee simply because they are pro-union.
False.
True or false? Is it false?
Yes.
Or did you say true?
No, I said false.
No, that's false. The employer may not, because that would be discriminating based on the fact that they're a union member or pro-union.
Yeah.
Wagner Act continue. So there's these mandatory subjects. So these are subjects like if you, let's just say me and you are a two-person bargaining union, and that's a term used in the book. And I didn't really get onto that in the slides, but I'll kind of just take a brief detour. So a bargaining union, let's say a union wants to come into a workplace, and it's actually a really good spot to do it. So a union wants to come into a workplace, and they're trying to figure out, okay, do we want to unionize the whole company? Do we want to unionize a specific subsection? Okay, so let's say the company comes, or the union, they're talking to some people there, or maybe the boss lets the union come in, and the union says, okay, I want to unionize just the people who make sandwiches. Okay. So we only deal with sandwich makers union. So that would be the bargaining unit. Or if the labor union, they come in and they say, we want to unionize the whole company. So that would be the bargaining unit, excuse me. And that matters when dealing with how unions are formed. And I'll explain what I mean just in a second, but keep the whole idea of a bargaining unit in your head. So if we were a two-person bargaining unit, and we decided to collective bargain about wages, and we went to the boss and we said, hey, this is our proposal. Wages, hours, and other conditions of employment are mandatory subjects. This means management must engage in good faith discussion over these topics. Other topics the management doesn't have to discuss, but they should. Now, what does wages, what does discussion about wages include? It could mean a lot of different stuff. It could be, pension, direct pay, fringe benefits. What does hours mean? It could be like seniority, like how do we calculate seniority? How do we determine who works when? Or do people with more seniority work day shifts? How do we determine disciplinary measures? So if you're late to work, how are you, written up for that? And then other conditions that could be union status, job security, subcontracting, volume of production. The other conditions of employment is so broad. So even though it's just hours, wages, and other conditions, that could encompass quite a bit. So definitely look at what fits in there. But anyway, a collective bargaining agreement, so a CBA, they're usually good for 3 years. When forming, and it's an agreement between the union and the owner, or the manager, or I mean, I guess the owner, manager, or the founder, whoever's running the company, that's who they agree with. Like I said, usually 3 years in length. Many times a no strike clause is going to be required in exchange for a grievance procedure, and most times a just cause requirement. So what that means is the labor union would be like, we're willing to agree not to strike, and if we strike, the CBA, you can rip it up and do whatever you want, but we will not strike if you say you will only fire people for just cause. So you can't just fire people because you don't like them.
Right.
And two, you give us a grievance procedure. So like if Timmy gets in a fight, like this is how it's going to go. Okay. So true or false, a majority of the bargaining unit must sign an authorization card for a union election. True or false?
What's a union election again?
That's where you even just elect to see if you're actually having, going to have the union.
Okay. Majority of our sign on.
This is foreshadowing, so it's stuff
Okay.
you would have read. It's stuff we haven't discussed yet.
Let me see. I feel like he talked about this, but I can't remember right now. Majority of bargaining union must sign an authorization card for the union. So I feel like it's true.
So it's false. It's just
Right.
30%.
Okay.
And that's not saying 30% must vote yes for a union. It's saying at least 30% of the bargaining unit must sign their authorization card saying, I agreed to hold an election.
Okay.
An
Okay.
authorization card, it's just saying, I authorize, the vote of a union, not I'm voting for the union. Do you see the difference?
Yes.
Okay. True or false, 50% plus one vote is required for the establishment of a union.
True.
Absolutely. So a simple majority, but some people are like, what's a simple majority? What's a complex majority? 50% plus one. Okay. True or false, if the vote fails, the union may try again in 95 days.
95 days. That's this one false.
Yeah, and what is the actual time?
I feel like it's shorter, not as longer. I'm guessing either 30 days or 60 days.
It's actually a year.
A year? Oh God, I was so off.
See, I was like, I'm gonna get her. I'm gonna get her. I'm gonna throw like a really. At first, so I actually typed it 3 months, and then I was like, no, no, I'm gonna type 95 days.
Yeah.
I think the 95 days is gonna trip her because she's
Yeah.
gonna think it's a specific number. No, it's a year, and it's
Okay.
at least a year. Okay, so now we're gonna talk more about that. So, well, I said we were. Um, Okay, so the Wagner Act has one last thing. It's called a right to strike, and we just talked about it a second ago, but more in detail. If the right to strike is conceded in the collective bargaining agreement, the CBA, then they cannot strike. Okay. If the labor union strikes, then permanent or replacement workers can be hired. So that's if they lawfully strike. So just an example of what I mean. I talked about this earlier, but just to really drive the point home, me and you are in a bargaining unit, we can lawfully strike. So maybe we didn't sign it, or the contract, like the bargaining unit's over, or excuse me, we're in a bargaining unit. Either the CBA said we still have the right to strike, meaning we didn't sign it away, or the CBA is expired, which if we gave our right to strike away, once the CBA is expired, we would also get that back. So you get what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we can lawfully strike. Okay. If
Yeah.
we lawfully strike, they and by they I mean the company, they can go out and get temporary or permanent replacements. If they get permanent replacements, congratulations. Whenever we end our strike, we just got laid off. We didn't get fired, we got laid off. But so that's what that right to strike means. So now we're going to talk about the Taft. Well, before we jump in, any questions about the Wagner Act?
Um, no, I do have a question, but it's not until later.
Okay, okay, cool. So the Taft-Hartley Act, it was passed to take back some of the union power and restore it to employers, okay? It was also known as the Slave Labor Act. You know, union people and a lot of the working class around the country hated it. The Taft-Hartley is technically an amendment to the National Labor Relations Act. So the National Labor Relations Act consists of the Taft-Hartley Amendment and the Wagner Act. It's all like one big pie, okay?
Right.
Section 7 of Taft-Hartley says employees have the right to join or refuse to join labor unions. And it also includes the right to work, not the right to strike. We're talking about the right to work, something we'll get to in a second, but just right to work. Free speech is also now regulated under the Taft-Hartley. So before, under just the Wagner Act, employers couldn't, say anything bad about unions because that would be, that could be seen as prejudicial, or employees may be scared to join unions. Under the Taft-Hartley Act, employers have the freedom of speech to say, don't join a union. Unions are bad. People who join unions stink. Unions, all they want to do is take all your money through dues, and they're just a bunch of corrupt people. But what they can't say is they can't threaten. So they could just say everything I just said, but they can't say if you join a union, you're fired. If
Right.
you join a union, I'm going to stab you. If you join a union, I'm going to cut your hours. If you join a union, you'll never get promoted. If you join a union, I'll break into your house and take your dog. They can't make threats. So, like I said, the Taft-Hartley changed that and permitted employers to speak out against unions, but they cannot threaten punishment for joining. It also added unfair labor practices for employees. As I said earlier, the Wagner Act only had unfair labor practices for employers, and under the Taft-Hartley Act, it added it for employees. So Wagner employers, Taft-Hartley employees, which meant if you smush them together for the National Labor Relations Act, both sides could get penalized if they do bad things. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Unions still were very powerful. Okay. So then the Landrum-Griffin Act, I abbreviate to the LGA, was then passed. Okay. It contained further limitations on unions. Okay. It made it harder for them to get established. So unions, and the reason why is unions started working with the mafia, the mob. They started doing really corrupt things because they lost a lot of power. Okay. So they're like, well, if we can't do it legally, we might as well, get the mob to like threaten people. So that's back to the day of Jimmy Hoffa. The LGA was passed to regulate financial and internal, I wrote international, internal operations of unions, dealing with how the union board is elected, dealing with how they can spend their money, how transparent they have to be. The Landrum-Griffin Act was also an amendment to the National Labor Relations Act. So now it consists of three things. So it consists of the Wagner Act, which is pro-unions, the Taft-Hartley Act, which brings back some of the, the labor unions' powers, and then it now consists of the Landrum-Griffin Act, which takes all the power away, essentially. So it's really neutered unions.
Okay.
So it's broken up a lot. So true or false, school teachers may unionize.
True.
Okay. Possibly. So remember, like you said, school teachers are government employees.
Right.
In some states,
Right. That does
very, very few states, they are allowing non-essential government employees to unionize. And there are teacher unions. So it just kind of keep that in back. Like, so it gives the example of like librarians. Like librarians may be able to strike depending on where they live.
okay. Well, it's because I just remember seeing like on the news probably like a year or two ago, like how these school teachers went on strike, but like in the certain states. But I'm not sure if I'm thinking that right.
Yeah, no,
Do you?
yeah, no, they have that right. It's just I think it's happened a lot in California. Like I know the LA Teachers Union, Los Angeles Teachers Union, or whatever it's called. Like they have gone on strikes. Oklahoma City went on strikes. It's
Yeah.
just I think probably the more local employees are given the ability
Okay.
to strike. Number two, unions have continued to decline.
Um. Oh, that one's hard. I would want to say false.
So you're saying unions have either stayed where they're at or they're growing again?
I feel like they stayed where they're at because I don't really feel like you don't really hear about unions anymore. Like you still hear about unions and going on strikes.
I would say unions have declined.
Okay.
And the third, and I'll just give you the answer on this one. Right to work laws are responsible for much of unions' decline. Yeah. So
Okay.
for some reason, I didn't include a slide on it. A right to work law. A s we mentioned it, but I wanted to go more in depth, and I guess I just forgot to. So a right to work law, it says in this state, and this was allowed under the, I believe Taft-Hartley. Yes, Taft-Hartley. Let's see, right to work. I just threw it in there. So the right to work law, it essentially says when you join work,
Uh-huh.
you have the choice of joining the union, okay? Or if you are at work and a union is established, you have the right to join it or not, okay? Before that, if you joined a place where a union is, you had to pay union dues and you had to be a member, okay?
Right.
Or if you worked at a place and then an election was held and then the union was established, you had to pay dues and you were a member. And that was under the Wagner Act. And so what that did was it allowed unions to have a lot of revenue and have, big war chests to be able to fight, collective bargaining agreements and unfair labor practice by employers and sue employers and threaten to sue employers, gave them a lot of power. So one way to hurt unions is by passing right to work laws, which, just as I said, if you go work for a manufacturer and it's unionized. If you don't want to pay union dues, you're no longer a member of the union. But anything the union does, you gain the benefits of it. So it creates this free rider situation where you're incentivized to not join the union if there already is a union, so that you don't have to pay, but you get all the benefits. You pay nothing and you get like you did pay. Because
Okay.
obviously, what happens is the less people that are paying, the less productive that union is. Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Now so unions are declining because not a lot of people want to pay them, and they just think that, well, since unions are so heavily regulated, there's not much they can do anyway. So why pay money if I'm not going to get any return, because they have no power anymore. So number four, in a right to work state, you are only protected by a union if you're a member. True or false?
False.
It's false. Yeah, you're given that protection. If there's a union, if you work at Subway and it's for all the employees outside of managers, if even if you're not a dues paying member, if they say this is how we're going to do wages and the management agrees, you're included in that. So you get all that for free. But you're not given the card that says union member. So that's all I have on this chapter. Any specific questions?
Just one. I don't think I truly understand why Texas doesn't allow unions.
Well, so most southern states don't like unions.
Right, right, yes.
Why don't they like unions? Most southern states are ran by by Republican political organizations.
Yeah,
So whether that's the governor or a state legislature, and traditionally the Republican Party has been pro business,
right,
and businesses largely hate unions
right.
because unions typically drive up costs for business, drive up transaction costs, add additional litigation, um, and it reduces their freedom to do whatever they want. So that's why they're seeing like that's why a lot of the southern states just have right to work laws because they're doing it to bust up unions.
Okay.
Um, Texas is one of those states. You know, it's had a Republican governor, I think, all my entire life, and they've had right to work states, or they've had right to work laws, and I would expect to see that for the foreseeable future.
Right. So it is legal. So it's legal to have unions here, but it's not very high that unions do much here in Texas. Is
Yeah,
that
unions are federally legal. Like a state
okay?
cannot pass a law that says unions are illegal.
I just thought they were illegal here in Texas, and I
No,
didn't.
no, they're legal in Texas, but
Okay.
they're not bound very found. And that actually brings up a topic. So he gives an example of Walmart, and it's something I swear he talks about in class because it's literally in the outline. It's not in the textbook. Walmart hates unions. Like they fight unions tooth and nail. They might actually kill people over unions. And I'm joking when I say that, but
Mhm.
like Walmart is very anti-union. And if you even start whispering about unions, maybe they commit an unfair labor practice. You know, maybe they fire you. Maybe they try to find a legitimate reason to fire you, even though they're really doing it because you talk about unions. But Walmart, you can look it up, is notoriously anti-union.
Okay.
So I think he usually talks about that in class. But
Yeah.
anything else?
No, it's just that one. I was just wondering why.
Okay. Well, if you have any other questions, you can always email me again. When are you starting the next chapter?
Um, Either today or tomorrow. 'Cause tomorrow I have my quiz for chapter 8.
Okay. Well, like I said, if you have any questions, just let me know.
Okay. And
Okay.
can you send me this PowerPoint,
Yeah,
please?
let me do that right now,
Yeah. Perfect.
so I don't forget. Just give me 1 second.
No problem.
Okay. Our OU law or OU we use Outlook, not Gmail, and so I'm always having to like figure out how to use
Oh,
it.
okay. No, it's no problem.
I guess okay. Well, how do I reply? And then they like completely just switch. And like I'm decently tech savvy, and they just like changed how they like how Outlook looks.
Right.
So now I'm like confused. Oh, what did I just do? Um, cool. I just sent it. So
Okay. Let me see if I got it.
um,
Probably took a while.
yeah, you can just I'll stay till you get it.
And how much do I owe you for today?
Since it was a
Um,
solo session, it's 20 an hour, but we just did 30 minutes, so we'll just say 10.
okay, perfect.
Um,
I just can't remember. I'm trying to exit out. Haven't got it yet. Maybe
you haven't
no.
gotten it yet. Okay, I can let me resend it. Okay, I'm resending. Okay, cool. Just resent it. I'm hoping it goes through this time.
I'm trying to read.